I'm excited to introduce you to Shannon Wilkinson, a life coach who's spent over a decade helping people break through their personal and financial barriers. Shannon is certified in neurolinguistic programming, hypnotherapy, and has an incredible gift for supporting others in aligning their values with their financial habits. From coaching hundreds of people through ambitious projects such as writing books and running marathons to guiding them toward a healthier relationship with money, Shannon's approach is deeply rooted in transformation and self compassion. Shannon and I met through the Invest for Better program, where we both share a passion for helping women align their investments with their values. Today, we dive into some of the most pivotal lessons Shannon has learned throughout her career, like how perfectionism often holds us back from achieving financial freedom, and why embracing the concept of good enough can be the key to success. We'll also explore Shannon's personal experiences with financial avoidance, her journey with ADHD and sensitivity, and how budgeting systems like You Need a Budget or YNAB have been life changing, not only for her, but for her clients as well. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by your finances or struggled with perfectionism, this episode is for you. Shannon brings a compassionate approach to life and money, helping us see how small shifts in mindset and practice can lead to big changes in how we feel about both. So get comfortable and let's dive into this conversation on how to create financial alignment, embrace imperfection, and build a life that truly reflects who you are. Welcome, Shannon, to Highly Sensitive Money. I'm excited to have you here and talk about all things money and sensitivity.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, Shannon, you and I met through the Invest for Better, training program. We were looking to be teaching one of the Invest for Better circles, which are for women investing circles. And you've been doing that for a while, right? It's been a couple of sessions.
Yeah, I was part of a circle, a member of a circle a couple of years ago, and then I led another circle. And next week on the 26th, I'm starting my second circle.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So for listeners, I'll link that in. And that's just, I actually didn't get to run the circle that I was hoping to run. There weren't enough signups. My life actually got really busy. I'd love to hear what led you to it and what do you enjoy about leading it today?
Well, I I started looking for ways that I could support women and ways that I could feel better about my money is invested and how make so my money doesn't just work for me, but that it is helping others at the same time, so able to do good with my money. And I just started Googling things and stumbled across Invest for Better. And it was sort of half of what I was really looking for. And it just so happened that they were starting circles pretty quickly after I found it. And so I signed up and really just loved the experience and loved what they were doing and wanted to share it with other people. So I signed up to be a leader, a circle leader.
Yeah, so wanting to have your money aligned with your values is what I'm hearing.
Right, right. And really wanting to, what sort of started it, it was both a sort of a gender issue, wanting to support women, and then also sort of a social justice issue in thinking about all of the systemic racism that we have in in all of our systems. And, thinking about, I'd never really thought about my bank, where I banked at. And so I wanted to become educated, become more aware, become educated so I could make different choices.
Yeah, and sometimes we think it's too overwhelming, too big of a change, and yet there's always things that can be done, like joining Invest for Better. But going back into your work specifically, I thought it was very interesting that a life coach would be teaching about investing. And then as we had our first conversation and I did more research for today, I realized that money's been a part of your coaching for a while. Can you introduce people to your work as a life coach? I know you've been a life coach for much longer than the term's been popular, and
Yes.
and how you got into YNAB coaching.
Yeah, of course. I became a coach back in 2003 when I had to spend a lot of time explaining what a life coach was. It definitely was not in the lexicon. And I, money was always sort of a part of what people talked about. If nothing else, talking about, the money that it costs to hire a life coach. So it was it's always a part of the conversations. And then a lot of people that I work with are interested in entrepreneurship and, whether it's starting a side hustle or something bigger. And money's a big part of that. It's, do you have the finances to support you? What do you need to support you? How do you know what you have? And it became pretty apparent to me that a lot of people really didn't want to pay attention to their money, that they were sort of scared of it and just kind of paid their bills and deposited their paychecks and hoped for the best. And I know, not probably the best strategy.
Yeah, money avoidance is a strategy, but like you said, not one of the best ones.
Yeah, yeah. So, I always sort of talked about it informally. And then probably, gosh, I don't know, 13 or 14 years ago, maybe, I learned about something called YNAB. You need a budget. It's the acronym for you need a budget. And I started using it, and it's a sort of a budgeting methodology, and it's a way of thinking about your money that is a little bit different than I had ever thought about it. And one of their main tenets is that you it's essentially zero-based budgeting. You give every dollar a job. Most people, when they think about budgeting, they're like, well, I make this much money and I spend this much on, you know, my rent or mortgage. I spend this much on my car. I spend this much on my groceries. And they try to make that, this much match up to this much. YNAB looks at it a little differently, where you don't budget your money until you have it, and you only budget money you have. So when money comes in, you give that money a job. What do you need that money to do before you have more money come in? And
So yeah, I'm confused as for people who are
yeah,
listening to the YouTube sorry, for people who are listening to the podcast as opposed to watching the YouTube, my face shows the confusion around YNAB. So if you have the same, I guess that makes sense for entrepreneurs, right? Because our income is so like
it's
moves
very
around so
variable.
wildly. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
variable. But it feels very, very hands-on to like
Hmm.
every time money comes in, you give it a job. So you have to be constantly tending to it.
Well, you do, but once you sort of get the hang of how YNAB works, the app that you're using, it automates a lot of that. So you're not really making that many decisions. And I'm managing, well, at one point I was managing three personal budgets and the budgets for two businesses and several rental properties. And it would take me, I'd spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes a morning and maybe 5 or 10 minutes every couple of weeks. And then once a month, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. So it really didn't take that much time but you're making active decisions about your money. And that's the whole idea behind it, is that it's really about aligning your spending and saving with your values. And by paying attention to what money is coming in and where you're choosing to put it, you can better spend according to your values. I had a YNAB client who was putting sort of all of their spending for groceries and wine and everything into one category. And they were just sort of tracking that as one thing. And then it occurred to her that they were kind of spending a lot of money on wine. And so she broke that out, and then she saw, like, oh, hey, this is how much money we're spending on wine. We really love wine. Do we love it that much or not? And they actually decided that they did, and so they made it a separate category so that they were spending consciously on wine. And they were like, as they were putting money into the wine budget, they knew that that was for something, to support something that they really loved, and that they weren't going to go overboard with it accidentally.
I love that. It's giving yourself permission, right? It's being like,
Yeah,
I really love pastries.
right.
So I am going to buy this pastry and I'm going to sit down. I'm going to savor every single bite of it. Yes, that's one of the magical things about budgeting and setting limits. It feels like
Yeah,
you're setting limits, you're depriving yourself, but actually you're giving yourself more permission to enjoy it. There's no
exactly.
lingering what ifs.
Right. And that's how I got my husband on board with YNAB. Because it
Mm.
felt very constrictive to him to begin with. Because I think you read on my website when I shared a little bit of my money story that, I sort of had this belief that hadn't really examined, that having enough money meant I didn't have to pay attention to it. And he was sort of operating under that same thing. What that meant was that he was spending money on sort of day-to-day things that he wanted, but he wasn't really setting money aside for bigger things. And the the clincher for him was, our friends were taking their kids on a big trip to Europe, and he said, "Oh, I wish we could take the kids on a big trip to Europe." And it's like, "Well, we could. What do you mean?" I said, "Well, look at the budget. And if we didn't spend this much on these things every month, we could set that money aside. And next summer, we could take the kids to Europe." And he was like, and then we did. And it was also really freeing to enjoy the trip, knowing that everything was paid for in advance. I mean, like, we had the money set aside. It wasn't like we were spending money as like, oh, well, pay for that when we get home. It was like, all the money is set aside for this. We don't have to worry about it. And it made it much more enjoyable for him to be on the trip, in addition to, saving up for it. And then it became like, do I want to spend $50 on this thing that looks really cool? Or do I want to put it towards this thing that has bigger meaning to me?
Mhm.
And that sort of threw him over the edge. Now he's a big advocate for YNAB too.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes I work with clients and that their dream is like to live a life where there's no trade-offs, right? Where you don't have to pick between one thing and the other. And I have clients with millions of dollars who are still making trade-offs.
Yeah. Well, you do. Even if you have plenty of money, you still have to make choices. And you
Mhm.
and you still have to, I mean, it's not limitless. It's not unlimited. I mean, your limits may be really big, but there's still a limit,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can fly first class, but you can't charter your own jet. Like, I don't know, what level they're at. Like, I'm like, oh, maybe I could go on a trip, maybe I could fly instead of drive. And then you're like, well, maybe I can, fly when I want to, as opposed to the red eye because it's and it's like,
Yeah.
but there's always there's always something, because there's always a higher level that, I mean, in the world we live in now, there's like, you can always go up a level wherever you're at.
Mhm. It's really about prioritizing things and taking the time to prioritize and get clear. So
Right.
I want to jump back into one of the questions that I love asking guests. What was the financial background of your childhood? And how do you see that impact you today, especially in the work that you do as a YNAB coach, if at
Hmm.
all?
We we grew up um, feeling. I mean, it's weird because on one hand, we didn't have a lot of money. On the other hand, we had a bigger house than most of my friends. We had rental properties. So it was kind of a weird combination. And I didn't realize until I was adult that like we had assets, but we were cash poor. So, there wasn't extra money. I worked all through school. I put myself through college, but there was always food on the table. There was no concern about that, but it was really kind of warring ideas about how we were doing financially. And I think as an adult that really showed up in that idea, like I shared earlier, that having enough money means not having to pay attention to it. So, my mom's like there with her pencil on the back of an envelope, like paying the bills. And so if I didn't have to do that, if I could just pay the bills, then I had enough money. But that wasn't super supportive either, because that things happen and you do have to pay attention to your money, and it you can get into trouble if you're not paying attention, even though it feels like you're keeping up. And I I think that I've been able, I mean, one of the beauties of being a coach is both through the trainings that I went through, where you have to like coach each other in your trainings, and having had a coach at different points during my life, and then being able to coach myself, I've worked through a lot of those issues. And now I feel a little bit of that, like my parents were sort of born during the Depression. So my grandparents are very much Depression era. And that kind of like, I can't let this go. Like, I've already spent money on this. I can't let it go. Wanting to like kind of hold on to stuff. And that's still something that I kind of deal with a lot. Like, cleaning out my closet. Well, I never wear this. Yeah, but it's good. It's still good. Or I paid a lot of money for it, or, whatever.
Yeah. As opposed to the Marie Kondo method of like, does this spark joy?
Oh my
Right.
God, that like gives me hives. I mean, the sparking joy part is awesome, but the like putting everything that you own, and then like, sure, I love to have the sparking joy stuff, but it's really hard to let go of the other stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely relate to that. And I think everyone to a certain level, we have that like the practical thing of keeping things we don't no longer need or no longer
Hmm.
want, no longer use. But what if just in case?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've come up with a lot of ways to help myself understand that it is useful to get rid of things, not just for me, but like, oh, 'cause I love thrift shopping. And,
Mhm.
when I find like, I found a cashmere sweater for like $6. It's like, oh my God, that's amazing. And so I think about like, I have this stuff that is wonderful, and someone would be so excited to find
Mm.
it at a thrift store. Or someone who is going to, I donate a lot of stuff to local shelter for women and non-binary folks. And thinking like, oh, someone was going to be so excited to like get something nice to wear and not just like, someone's old hand-me-downs. And just because I bought this and then I ended up not liking it doesn't mean someone else isn't going to love it.
Mhm. And there's something for me too about like giving myself permission to have things I like, even if it often means less things. There's also that movement, which is a bit related to social justice of like, if you save up to buy better quality things that
Mm-hmm.
last longer, that means there's less things in the dump, right? Like fast fashion is one of the
Right.
leading causes of contamination. Things that last like for such a short amount of time, they're like disposable, right? You wash
Right.
it 10 times and it's falling apart. Yeah, just consumerism. Like, how do you, it's kind of like a furniture that's meant to be disposable, like cell phones that are you replace every 2 years. It's a very different mindset from maybe what Depression era folks would have
Mm-hmm.
valued.
Right. Right. And it is really interesting to sort of go between the two things. And like I used to replace my computer, every 2 to 3 years and felt like I needed it. And now I'm like trying to make my computer last as long as I can make it
Mhm.
last. I mean, it's mostly because it's the last one that has it's the last MacBook Pro with the touch bar, and I love the touch bar. I'm like the
Yeah.
only one in the world that loves the touch bar. And so it's like, I want this, it's like already 4 years old. It's like, I want this computer to last forever. What can I do to make it last forever? And I think, you know what? Why not translate that into everything? Like, why not buy things that can last forever? Not just because this is the last one, but just because.
Mhm.
Like, we don't want to create that waste that is a burden on the planet and on people.
Yeah, and again, it's I mean, one of the things is like you need to have the money in order to do it. I remember reading this meme of like it's over the long run, it's cheaper to buy high quality shoes
Mm-hmm.
than to buy low quality shoes because the low quality shoes you have to replace them so often. But the thing is, you have to start off with access to enough money to buy the high quality shoes.
Right, right. And then you end up in a catch 22. And you, if you start with the low quality shoes, you have to keep replacing them. So you can't save money to get the high quality shoes.
Yeah. So, Shannon, how did you find out about what it means to be highly sensitive and how did you incorporate that into your work? And do you work with it? Do you support your clients with that?
Well, I think I can't even remember when that book first came out, The Highly Sensitive Person. I mean, it's
I think
been,
it was in the early
I
90s.
was gonna say, because I'm pretty sure my sister read it and said, I think you should read this. And it really resonated with me. And I mean, I've always felt like I I don't know, like I hear a little bit more, I see a little bit more, I notice a little bit more than most people. And I felt for a while that, I always thought I was an extrovert. And then I thought, well, maybe I'm actually an introvert because I find it really draining to be out in the world. And then I realized, oh, no, I'm a highly sensitive extrovert. So I
Me
get
too, me
energy from
too.
people, but it's, the world is sort of draining. It's really
I remember
complicated, right?
I remember hearing an explanation of it of like being at home alone because you really need to rest while missing people. It was one of
Mm-hmm.
those like getting completely opposite desires and like sitting with it at the same time and being like, well, I want a group of people and I find them overwhelming. Like,
Yeah. 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 And then over the years, I've learned that there are actually a few physical reasons why I have that. In my early 50s, I was diagnosed with a congenital hearing loss that I never knew I had. I misheard people a lot, and sounds really, some certain sounds really bothered me. And I could hear, like, and I can still hear, that high pitched ringing that only teenagers can hear. I can hear that. But in the mid ranges, which is certain letter sounds, vocal sounds, I have moderate hearing loss. And it is a very rare form of hearing loss. I think only 2 or 3% of people with hearing loss have this particular kind. It's called a cookie bite hearing loss because your audio,
What a cute name, a cookie
I know,
bite.
because your audiogram is like normal on either side. Like, this is your high end is normal, your low end is normal, and in the middle it's like someone took a bite out of the cookie. I know, it's really cute.
Cute and probably difficult to care for given that
Yeah.
it's not that common. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so, it never made sense to me why stuff sounded loud to me, but also I couldn't understand what people were, it sounded like people were mumbling. And like I would want someone to speak up, but then it would be too loud. And so once that was diagnosed and I wear hearing aids now that correct for that, it really sort of changed things. And I still have a hard time with loud sounds or particular sounds, or like white noise drives me crazy. But because I don't have to work so hard to hear people because I am wearing hearing aids, that has all lessened a bit. Like my brain isn't having to do as much of the work hearing now that my ears can do more of the work, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I know for myself, as I've like learned more about what it means to be HSP,
Mm-hmm.
I now have more patience with like when I notice and my social battery is like done.
Yeah.
There's nothing left. Like knowing what the I don't it's not a problem. Knowing what the difference is just makes it easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the first day I got my hearing aids. I went to a dinner party, and it had been getting bad. And the reason I got diagnosed was I had been in a car accident that caused a number of issues, but one of the things was this worsening tinnitus. And so I went to an ENT, and he was like, "Have you never worn hearing aids?" No. Have you never worn hearing aids? But it turned out that the problem was, after getting a concussion, a series of concussions with this last car crash resulting in one, my brain wasn't able to help me hear as much as it had before. And I sort of didn't really want to believe it. And it took another year or two before I went to another audiologist, and she confirmed it. And again, was like, "How have you not had hearing aids your whole life? Like, this is kind of amazing." And then I got them and went to this dinner party, and I could hear people. I mean, I could have not just a conversation with the person right next to me, but I could have a conversation with the person at the end of the table. And that wasn't something that I really had been able to do, particularly after this series of head injuries I had. And I had, my world had sort of gotten smaller because I couldn't hear people. And, you hear about that with older folks. Like their social circles get smaller and smaller because they have undiagnosed hearing loss. And I didn't really realize that that was happening to me. It was just like, it's not fun for me to go. Why would I go? but I want to spend time with people, but I can't understand them. And, it's this whole back and forth. But my husband commented on, he said, you were just sitting there having a conversation, and normally I didn't realize how much I read lips until the pandemic, and I could not see people's mouths anymore. But I would be really, looking at people and reading lips and looking at cues to understand what they were saying. And I didn't have to do that. I could just sit there and hear.
Yeah. Well, it's like when you see those scrambled words, right? Like there's a word that's misspelled, but because
Mm-hmm.
we've read for so long, we know what it means.
Yep.
So your brain was like doing things to fill in the gaps. I have a friend who's very colorblind and he's a chef. So I'm like, how can you be a chef that arranges food in like such
Yep.
an artistic way while you're colorblind? Like I'm always curious what other senses have had to come in to
Uh-huh.
kind of fill in the gap.
Right. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
so interesting. Yeah. And the other thing that I've had a lot of interesting diagnoses lately. I almost 2 years ago now, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which made a lot of things make sense in my whole life. And, one of the things about ADHD that a lot of people don't know, it's not that you can't pay attention or that you can't focus. It's that you're taking it all in and it's too much. And you can't sort of focus on what you want to focus on and ignore the rest. And sort of understanding that has helped me manage some of those things that I was experiencing as a sensitive person, and give myself a little bit more grace about it, I think.
And that makes me I mean maybe I'm just guessing wrong here, but I wonder if that's what makes YNAB so appealing, because it gives every dollar a job. Like it's so structured that you can completely let go.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. I hadn't really put that together like that, but I love systems and I love organization, and I really struggle to maintain it. And YNAB makes it easy for me to maintain. And it also, like, I feel like when I go in every morning and I categorize my transactions and I make everything balance out, like it, dopamine hit, dopamine hit. It's like, it's so satisfying. And then, it has like the columns are all green, which means, everything's organized the way it's supposed to. And I can do that with such little effort, and it's so satisfying. It keeps me coming back to it. And it's not just, it's not like I'm playing a game and there's no value in it. It's also me paying attention to my finances so that I can, do the things that really matter to me.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's like having all of the information. I know for myself, whenever I start to get overwhelmed, I write down a to-do list of all of the things on there. And there's things that are so silly, like take the dog out for a walk. Like I'm not going to forget to take my dog out for a walk, but it's on top of me as if it were a boulder, with like
Right.
10 other things. So it's like writing it down and being like, this needs to get done today. And this is something that I can think about in 3 years.
Right. Yep. Yep. And you could just organize it and then be like, okay, what are the things I could do now? And what are the things I could put on another page?
I don't know if that's like 100% related to being HSP or just scattered person, but I do remember hearing like that's so HSPs often are very focused on social justice because we see the connections of everything like the web,
Mm-hmm.
and because we tend to be more empathetic, other people's pain is our pain. I just heard recently that Oscar Wilde, the poet from like hundreds of years ago, was a socialist, not because he was really a socialist, but because he didn't really like seeing poor people. Like he wanted everyone's needs to be
Yeah.
taken care of. Like, huh, what an interesting.
Oh, that's so funny. Like, oh, I don't like that. So let's just raise everybody up to my
I
level.
know. Let's make sure everybody has like food and shelter
Yeah,
and health care.
because I don't like to look at this.
I
That's
feel
so
conflicted about
funny.
it. And I
Yeah,
also identify. Yeah.
right, right. I know. It's like, well, does it matter like what's really behind it if everyone is getting raised up? That's funny. But yeah, that having that extra empathy has been so valuable in my coaching because um, I can I get a real sense of what people are experiencing sometimes even before they realize it when I'm talking with them, and I can sort of it makes it easier to guide them to what they need for themselves than if I was just doing it from a very intellectual, logical place. And I think that's been super valuable to have that part of being an HSP is really sort of feeling like I can not like I can intellectually understand what someone is going through, but like I can feel it.
Body awareness. And I know I heard in one of your podcasts, maybe I read it on your website, that because of the concussions, like the way that your way of being
Mm-hmm.
changed a bit. I would love to hear more about that, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, of course. Well, as a little background, had I've had many concussions over my lifetime. I rode horses and fell off horses. I played basketball and had people fall on me, and I mean, I had a lot of like odd things happen. And one of the other things is I have a tendency to get lightheaded and faint. And so I have fainted and hit my head a number of times. But the what you're talking about is I had this weird series of unrelated incidents that all happened in July, 4 years in a row, where I received a concussion. So the first was in July of, let's see, I have to go backwards, 11, I think. And I was mountain climbing. I was climbing Mount Hood here in Oregon, and I was leading our group, and we were in sort of this one little bit of technical area, and I had just sort of planted my ice axe and my ice tool and kicked in my feet, and I was looking
So you
down.
were rock climbing, ice rock climbing?
It was mountaineering, and this section was ice that
Wow.
to get to the summit of the mountain. And so I was just like in, and then I was looking down to see where my next foot steps would go. And as I looked down, I got hit in the back of the head with a huge chunk of ice that fell from above. I was wearing a helmet, but because I was solidly planted with 4 points of contact and not moving, I lost consciousness briefly, but I didn't fall. I just sort of slumped down, and because I was looking down, it hit the back of my helmet. Had I been looking up, it would hit me in the face. It's like a million ways. Like if I had not been fully planted, I would have gone tumbling. I mean, there's only one way that I come out of that relatively unscathed, and that was the position I was in. But so I got a pretty gnarly concussion from that. And then a year later, this was a really freak accident. I mean, that you can understand. Like, you could understand that, like, ice might. hit you when you're climbing a mountain. But this time I was, the giant roll carts for like garbage or yard debris or whatever,
Yeah.
recycling. I was at a friend's house and filling one of those with, she had an apple tree and I was filling it with apples. And I went to move it with the lid open over the top of my hand. And because it was bottom heavy from the apples, the wheels shot out from underneath of it. And because I had the lid over my hand, it trapped my hand on the lid. And so as it went down, it pulled me down and pulled my head into the edge of the plastic. And I got a huge gash on my forehead here, which also resulted in a concussion. And then the next July,
You must have been pretty frightened of July
I know,
at
I
that
was
point.
totally like, come on. I had I was at an event in Portland and it was having a closing party in this area in downtown Portland called Pioneer Courthouse Square, and it's a big brick square. It was a big dance party, and I was there with a friend, and it's this huge thing. We're dancing, I'm having a good time, and all of a sudden, I'm like, I'm going down, and I just fainted and hit just like flat on my back and hit so hard that my head like ricocheted back and hit twice. And then it was like I had a brief, like I'm going down, I sort of was out, then I kind of woke up. I remember hitting my head once, twice, and then I was out. And then I didn't come to until the EMTs were there.
Yikes.
So another concussion. Then the following July I was just sitting at a stoplight minding my own business. And I swear I just had the thought like, oh, it's the middle of July. I haven't had an accident yet. And then I am sitting at a stoplight
Oh
and
no.
a car rear ends me without even like there's no brakes, there's no warning at all. He was texting and didn't see me stop and hit me full speed on a highway. So that was the fourth concussion of 4 Julys in a
And
row.
we hope the fourth and final one, we hope.
Yeah, knock wood, right? Yeah, so through all of that, there was a lot of recovery. I did a concussion management program at the local medical school, has a big teaching hospital and program, and I did a concussion program through them that included speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. I It was interesting because I didn't seem that different to people, but I felt very different. And like I ran into stuff all the time, which I didn't used to do. And we found out doing some vision exercises that while I could see with my right eye, I wasn't really seeing with my right eye. Like I wasn't blind in my right eye, but they did this test where you look at a chart where letters are in different colors, and then you put on glasses that have one color lens in one eye and one color lens in the other eye. And I couldn't see anything with my right eye. Like I couldn't see any of the letters. It wasn't translating. And it it just changed a lot of how my brain worked. All of a sudden I realized that I really couldn't hear very well. And and this is still something like when would picture a clock, I would see it upside down and reversed. So like if I was trying to, this is even hard for me to think about, like if I was trying to think about like it's 10 after 10 And what's 20 minutes from now, it would be like reversed, and I couldn't figure it out. Like, or I would get it off by 40 minutes or something like that. And it took a long time for me to realize that that's what was happening. And already I'm like, have complete time blindness anyway. I never know what time it is. I never know the passage of time. And then this just really messed things up. So I just had to learn a lot of new strategies and do a lot of different kinds of exercises. I basically had to not learn how to read. Like, I could read, but I couldn't follow the words on the page. So I'm a voracious reader, and I didn't read a book for 6 months.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had to do all these eye exercises to be able to get that back. And it was, I remember I chose to read I Capture the Castle. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it was a book that I knew and loved. It's sort of a older, I mean, I think it was probably written in like the 30s or 40s or something, but it's sort of that era's version of a YA novel. And I knew the story. And so I started rereading books, and I never reread books. I hated rereading books. And I started by rereading books so I didn't have to worry about remembering what was going to happen. Like, I already sort of knew it. So I didn't have to remember it from reading time to reading time. And
Right.
yeah, so it changed a lot of things. And one of the most wonderful things that happened that I was sort of surprised to realize was it got rid of even more of the sort of intellectual, logical part of my brain when I was coaching. So I was much more intuitive. It was easier to understand what was going on with people. I could
Was
see,
there
hear,
like
feel
less,
more.
was there like less? Because sometimes one of the things that they say is we're always interpreting things, like our mind is interpreting things. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe there was less interpretation and just more direct experience.
Exactly. Exactly. And I it just made it easier. It was so weird to me. All these other things were so much harder. And then this was so much easier.
So coaching became much easier. What a gift to your
Mm-hmm.
clients, right? And I
Yeah.
think a lot of the times as a coach, like we get in our own way where our client says something and I'm like, well, I'm in my head doesn't know how to get there. And
Mm-hmm.
I get in the way of the client
Right.
as opposed to like when my head's not interpreting, it's just like, well, let's open it up, client. Let's see more of that. Like a lot of the times as
Mm-hmm.
a coach training, like that's what I'm being asked to tone down, to
Right.
not focus so much on the how. Wow, how interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It just really opened up my ability to be fully present.
Well, I hope that there's no more concussions needed. You are now fully present, whatever those were for.
I know. I hope I am done with that.
Yeah, it's been 9 years. So, in preparing for this, I listened to some of your podcast, Getting to Good Enough, and I specifically like enjoyed listening to the goodbye episode.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So what I understand from the Getting to Good Enough podcast, it was you and a friend who, like, you had perfectionism, she didn't, and you were
Mhm.
getting together once a week to talk about what is it like to have perfectionism? How does it stop us? How do we get through it?
Right.
And by the end of it, there was kind of like a natural stopping point in both of your lives. You both
Mhm.
decided to let it go. And I have questions about, like, I obviously want to dive into like what is perfectionism? How do you help clients move through it? But also what is it like to close a chapter? Right? Because it sounds like it was 5 years of your life.
I know, it was 5 years every week for 5 years. I mean, it was it was the right decision, and it was the right decision for that time. I mean, there were a number of reasons why it was difficult for us to do it at that point. And also, it just felt like time to let it go. I mean, the biggest thing that's been hard about it is I miss talking to my friend for an hour every week.
I imagine.
I mean, we still talk all the time. I just, spent 2 weeks with her, and we see each other. She's in St. Louis, and but we just don't have that regular. We recorded every Monday afternoon, and we just don't have that regular Monday afternoon date. So that was hard. And I don't. This is sort of finesse, but I don't miss doing the podcast, but I miss having the podcast, if that makes sense. Like I don't I don't miss sort of everything that goes into creating the podcast. But if I could just like magically have new episodes every week, that would be amazing. But it became, you talk about one topic for 5 years, that you really sort of cover it. And there's always more to talk about, but we really sort of felt like we would just sort of be rehashing the same stuff if we kept going with it. But I really enjoyed having that weekly contact with my friend, with that weekly contact with listeners, with having this living resource available to share with people. And, we still have this huge catalog of episodes that are available. We've made everything still available. You can still listen to all, however many episodes we have. I forgot what number we ended on, but
250.
250.
Yeah, that's a beautiful round number to finish.
Yeah. So, those are all available. And, we just got an email the other day from someone who said, I just discovered your podcast and I'm starting from the beginning. And I love that I have so many to look forward to. And that's so meaningful. And I love that people understand that, even though something was recorded 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, that it is still a value and they can still get something out of it, because perfectionism is something that I think all of us deal with at some point, or most of us deal with at some point. Even our shtick was sort of, I'm a perfectionist who's getting better at good enough, and Janine, my co-host, is naturally good at good enough. And but still, in so many episodes, she'd realize, like, oh, I'm actually being perfectionistic about this thing, and I didn't really realize that I was. And so, it's something that we can all kind of pay attention to and embrace good enough. And, every once in a while, we sort of play around with the idea of reviving a podcast that's like the good enough life, or like, what's it like living a life
Mm.
that's good enough? And especially in a culture where so many people are striving for more.
Yeah, yeah, we have endless desires. It feels like what I understand about perfectionism, I think about it, my lens on it has been through like Brene Brown's work,
Mm-hmm.
who talks about perfectionism as being image management, also as women, since we're more primed towards perfectionism, more afraid of doing things wrong. Is there a podcast that you would recommend people, like that was one of your favorite ones, that if they were only going to listen to one, that it would be that one where it talked about perfectionism?
Oh gosh, God, I cannot remember what the first episode was called. Done is better than perfect, I think. That's a great place to start. And I think that is sort of the underlying theme of so much of what we talked about, is how perfectionism keeps you from doing what you want to do. And, so Janine is a professional organizer. And, so many of the people, especially she's sort of working with a different clientele now, but particularly when she first started, a lot of her clients who were chronically disorganized are perfectionists. And it's because they're waiting for the perfect system, or they don't want to do it until they can do it perfectly. And it can really hold you back. And so if that's something that someone sort of identifies with having a tendency towards perfectionism, that idea of done is better than perfect is really a wonderful place to start.
That's perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
One other amazing resource that you have is the quiz that you have on temporal motivation theory.
Oh, well, no one knows that's what it's about.
It's in there. You read it so much. I
I
remember reading it and being like, what
yeah.
is this temporal motivation theory?
Yeah, well, so it's a quiz on understanding your productivity blocks. So it's really sort of what is behind your perfectionism, or sorry, your procrastination. Not
Yes.
that they aren't related, but
Mhm.
but so it talks about these different productivity blocks, and I created this quiz based on temporal motivation theory, which is essentially that um, time has a big impact on when you do something, and or your motivation behind doing something. And we probably have all experienced this. Like, if you have a deadline, it's easier to get something done, especially the closer you get to that deadline, than if you don't have a deadline. And that's just,
Definitely, I identify.
very roughly the idea behind it. But what these folks found out in their research was that procrastination could essentially be reduced down to a calculation, to a formula. And if you've sort of put together the pieces of your formula properly, you could get things done. And I think when you took the quiz, you found out that your block was reward. And
Yes.
so if you add reward into your calculus for getting something done, it becomes easier to get it done. And, there are 4 different ones. I'm not going to tell them all because I want people to be surprised. But the end result is that when you find out what your block is, you add more of that into your situation, then it's easier to get it done.
Yeah, yes, yes, yes. And I've naturally learned that rewards help
Mm-hmm.
me. I have a dog and I always like reward myself with walking her, which is something I have to do anyway. So
Right.
it there's like natural breaks in the day of like, all right, I did this one thing. Now I can take her out for a walk. And it's really just it's made me more productive. It's made me recognize what I do get done
Mm-hmm.
more, which I think is also helpful to actually savor the reward.
Absolutely. And that's the biggest thing about, or one of the places where people really get stuck is, especially if they have kind of an overwhelming to-do list, or if they maybe have issues with worthiness or something like that, like, or they have this long history of procrastinating, and so they don't want to give themselves credit for what they do because they still have all this stuff left to do. Like, it doesn't count until it's all done. And then you have to remember, well, it's never all done. It's like working at the post office. The mail keeps coming.
Or cleaning, you
Yeah,
just have to keep cleaning.
you clean and then it gets dirty and you clean again. And so there's so many things that we think of as discrete tasks that are really like maintenance systems, that it's So giving yourself a way to know that you're done for now,
Mm.
and giving yourself credit for reaching that point. Because it was like at the very, very beginning of when we started talking, I was talking about those dopamine hits. Like giving yourself credit gives you that dopamine hit, and then you want more of that. But if instead you're like beating yourself up and like, well, yeah, so I finished that, but I still have all this other stuff to do, or well, I finished it this time, but how many times did I not do it? Then who wants to do that? Like, I don't want to, if I feel bad every time I think about doing something, I'm not going to do it. Or I'm going to have to really like muscle my way through it. But if I figure out how to feel confident about it, to reward myself, to enjoy it, then it makes it easier to do. And then it sort of loses that power that it has over us. It's not this thing looming over us. It's this just a thing on a list that I can do and check off.
Yeah, it's like that's what's so amazing about coaching. And I mean, working with money, it's really behavior change, right?
Yes.
So it's not like you can be done with money. It's
Right.
behavioral change. Again, going back to what it says on on your website that you thought financial health was like having the freedom to ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And we can make the corollary with health, right? Being in good health doesn't mean you get to ignore it. Being in good health means you get to maintain it. You don't get
Right.
sick.
And you get to keep exercising and eating well and, taking your supplements or whatever it is you do to have
Mhm.
achieved good health. Like, it's not
Yeah.
like well, I exercised, I never have to do it again.
Yeah, it's one of those things of like having our self-talk be a positive upward cycle.
Yes.
And sometimes it isn't. I know I've struggled with it myself. Like when you mentioned worthiness issues, I'm like, yeah, that's probably why it's helpful for me to have rewards because it just like reminds me like, oh, I am worthy of having clothing that sparks joy or whatever it
Yeah,
is.
exactly. Exactly. I was just thinking that same thing. Like, just really recognizing that you're okay who you are right now. Like,
You're
just
enough just as you are.
exactly. You are good enough. and and even if you've disappointed yourself or others in the past, let it be in the past. And that doesn't speak to who you are as a person. You are still worthy of taking care of yourself. You're still worthy of having things that spark joy. You're still worthy of paying attention to your money and having money, even if you've made mistakes in the past. You're
Mhm.
still worthy. Each of us is.
Right. One of my favorite definitions of social justice is to see that all of our well being is interrelated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that, I mean, I've always had this like weird little secret, I don't know, theory slash fantasy that if everyone on the planet had a strong sense of self worth and self love and self compassion, that we wouldn't have the problems in the world that we have. Because all of a sudden we wouldn't have greed, we wouldn't have wars, we wouldn't have race. Because if you have self-love and self-worthiness and self-compassion, you have it for everyone else too. and
Right.
and and if you can recognize it in yourself and you can recognize it in others, then all of a sudden all of this conflict goes away. I don't need to know that I'm better than you, because I know that I'm worthy. So I don't have to look for external validation. And if I'm not seeking external validation, I don't need power.
Right, right,
And if I
right.
don't need power, then I'm free to be generous and want good for everyone.
Yeah. Well, Shannon, I want to end on that lovely, lovely note. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for sharing your experiences with money, high sensitivity, the different head injuries that you've gone through.
It's been my pleasure. Love talking with you.
Thank you. Where can people find you?
They can find me on my website at shannonwilkinson.com. And the podcast there's a link to it on my website, but you can also go directly to gettingtogoodenough.com.
Yeah. And I highly recommend that people check out that temporal motivation theory procrastination quiz. I thought that was very helpful. And definitely also check out YNAB.
Yes.
I'm not trained in it myself, but I've heard wonderful things about it.
Yes. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Highly Sensitive Money, where we explore the connections between money, values, and sensitivity. I hope you found today's conversation with Shannon Wilkinson insightful and that it gives you new perspectives to reflect on. If you'd like to learn more about my services or resources, head over to my website, allthecolors.net, where you can also find a fun quiz to help you uncover your money patterns. It's a great way to start understanding how your relationship with money affects your decisions and how you can begin making small shifts toward greater financial empowerment. If you've enjoyed today's episode, I'd love for you to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more people and continue sharing these important conversations. Thanks again for tuning in and check out the resources we have in the show notes.